to give you all a chance to find out from the horse's mouth, as it were, what it's really like to be in Congress, what the issues are, how you go about passing a bill. And many of these are issues which questions from you have already been submitted in advance by email and by Twitter. But now is your chance to put your questions to the former members of Congress. Please use the Q&A function. The chat, I think, is disabled, but use the Q&A function, and we will get through as many questions as we can in the hour. I want to quickly thank a number of people who've made this possible. The American Embassy in London and the British Association of American Studies have provided financial and other support, as has the Association of Former Members of Congress. I want to mention in particular Anna Martz and Christina Tribble at the American Embassy, and also our good friend Cara Rodway from the Eccles Centre in the British Library. And in the REI, I want to thank Tangela Chambers, our intern, and our communications officer, Alice Kelly, for making this happen. And I'd also ask you, if you can, at the end of this session, to take the time to fill in a survey, just a 30-second survey, giving us some feedback on this. I'm going to shut up in a moment, but I just want to introduce the chair for this session, Professor Robert C. Lieberman, who's the Krieger-Eisenhower Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, a very distinguished professor of American politics. His most recent book is Four Threats, the Recurrent Crises of American Democracy, which I recommend. And we're very honored that Professor Lieberman has joined us here in Oxford at the Rothermere American Institute this year as the Winant Professor of American Government. I'm going to hand over to Rob, who is going to introduce our two former congressmen, and we'll take it from there. But welcome from me. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Adam. And let me add my welcome to everybody, and particularly welcome our two guests for this afternoon. And I'll introduce them in turn and then ask them each to open up with a few remarks. First, we're joined by Anne-Marie Buerkle, who represented New York's 25th district, that's the area around Syracuse, if you're familiar with New York State, from 2011 to 2013. While she was in the House, she served on the committees on Foreign Affairs, Oversight and Government Reform, and Veterans Affairs, and she served as a congressional representative to the UN General Assembly. After leaving Congress, she served for a number of years on the US Consumer Product Safety Commission from 2013 to 2019, and she served as that commission's chair for the last 2 years of her service. We're also joined by Ben Chandler, who represented Kentucky's 6th district from 2004 to 2013. While he was in the House, he served on the very important Appropriations Committee, the Intelligence and Foreign Affairs Committee as well. While he was in Congress, he also chaired the British American Parliamentary Group and has spent a lot of time not just working in the House of Representatives of the United States, but working in the British Parliament as well. So perhaps he can share some comparative reflections with us on what it's like to work in the legislatures here and there. Before being elected to Congress, he served in a number of state elected offices in his home state of Kentucky, where he was both auditor and then attorney general. So we're very lucky to be joined by two very distinguished and experienced public servants, and I'm looking forward to a stimulating hour learning from them. So why don't we start with Congresswoman Berkel. Tell us a little bit, just some reflections on your time in Congress. What stands out? What do you see as the most important things that you might have taken away from serving in Congress? And what is it that we who haven't been on the inside of the institution should know about it?
Well, thank you very much, Robert, and thanks for your kind introduction. And I just want to say welcome to all of the participants. We're so delighted to be here. Congress to Campus is a program that really, we hope we can incentivize folks to become a part of and be involved in public service. And that's really sort of the essence of why we do this. So I'm delighted to be here, and I really look forward to your questions. So I'm just going to make this very brief. So I, unlike Ben, who is joining me here today, I was not in politics all of my life. I started out my professional career as a nurse and was in healthcare. After I had my kids, I went back to law school, actually, and at the age of 40, and then practiced for a teaching hospital in upstate New York for a number of years. And it was the Affordable Care Act in 2009 and 2010 that really prompted me to run for Congress. There was no opponent for the person who was in Congress. So I thought, well, at least people will have a choice. And so it was 2010. It was when the Tea Party, although I wasn't part of the Tea Party, but that's sort of the nomenclature they put on that group when the Republicans took back the Congress. So when I got to Congress, having no experience in this political world, I mean, I could spend days talking to you about my impressions and my reflections on that. There was jubilation on the Republican side because we had just won the majority in Congress. So that was sort of the tone that was set. At the time, I'm sure you're familiar with John Boehner and Eric Cantor. He was the speaker and he was the majority leader. And they decided that we were going to vote on a whole lot of bills, which we did. And so the first impression I had of being there was, this is a very busy place. We are going back and forth 3 and 4 times a day from our offices, voting on all kinds of pieces of legislation and bills, which, just as a footnote, they didn't really go anywhere because the Senate was a Democratic Senate. So all the Republican was passing all these bills. The Democrats were not in the House, were not passing, in the Senate, were not passing them. But being in Congress, I will say, despite everything you hear, and then, you know, the media puts a nasty spin on it sometimes, and there's a whole lot of pundits who talk about serving in Congress and members of Congress. There were just a few things that really stuck out with me. Number one, it was the greatest honor of my life. It really, having that opportunity, walking up the stairs in the House where you think about all of those who went ahead of us and the woman who laid the foundation so that I could serve. And those, it's just so historic and so meaningful. And it's really almost a hallowed place. And so there's just this tremendous feeling of what an honor it is and how glad I am to be here. And then after that, again, something that's not done well with the media and how they portray, we did an awful lot of bipartisan things. We worked together, especially on the Veteran Affairs Committee. I was chairwoman of the subcommittee on health. There were many opportunities to work with folks on both sides of the aisle. And we were friends with each other. We got along well, but that's not how the media portrays it all the time. And so I do want to say the people who are serving in Congress have the right spirit in their hearts. They want to do the right thing for their constituents, for their nation. And it's just a wonderful, it was just it's hard to describe the experience of being there. And I would say to all of you, someone who had never been in politics and had the opportunity to be the first woman to hold this seat in Congress, that my piece of advice would be, don't ever let anyone tell you you can't do it, even if it seems outside of the realm of what you've done, what your accomplishments are, because that was the kind of the response I got when I wanted to run for Congress. Well, you've never done this, you don't have money, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, the amount of money it takes to run and be in politics. But that, if you don't remember anything else today, be strong in your convictions and know that you can do whatever it is you set out to do. And you just have to work hard and be willing to do that. So I'm going to stop talking and turn it over to Ben.
You're muted, Ben.
There we go. Nice to be with you, Rob. Anne Marie, nice to be with you again. This is the second one that we've done together, and it is particularly nice to be with folks in the UK. I have a long history with the UK, dating back to the early 1980s. I'm old enough to tell you that I was an intern in the British Parliament when Margaret Thatcher was prime minister and Michael Foot was the head of the Labour Party. Now that's ancient history, but it was interesting times. I have been very fortunate in my life to as Anne Marie mentioned, spend a good deal of it in politics and public service. I've been also lucky for the last almost decade to not have to spend time in elective office and also still be involved in public service. But I got elected to the United States Congress in a special election, which you all would refer to in Britain as a by-election. It occurred in 2004, and it was the first time that a Democrat had taken a Republican seat in a special election in 13 years in the United States. And it was particularly important because it was the first win that Nancy Pelosi had in a race on her way to becoming the first woman speaker in the history of our country. So it was quite a heady time for me when it happened, and it very well known amongst my colleagues very quickly. Uh, I ended up spending about a decade in the Congress. Enjoyed most of it. It was a lot of work. I think people don't realize how hard congressional folks work. It's constant. You've got really several jobs at once. You've got to deal with all the legislation. You've also got to represent your constituents in Washington, and you've got to spend a great deal of time with them at home, trying to let them know that you're representing them and taking care of their needs as they try to interface with the federal government in one way or another. Also, one thing that I think it's important to point out, and I think we'll maybe talk about some of the differences throughout this time between Congress and the Parliament, but the congressional seats are dramatically larger than parliamentary constituencies. We represent about 3/4 people, each one of the Congress people. Their districts are about that size. And we also have a lot of difference between the House and the Senate. The House is very special in the minds of those who serve there because it is referred to as the People's House. There has never been a member of the House, and I suppose this is true with Parliament too, but every member has been elected. Nobody gets appointed to the House of Representatives. Senators, on the other hand, in the US Senate, can be appointed by their states if there's a vacancy. So a number of senators through the years have served by appointment. The House terms in Congress are only 2 years, and that's extremely important too, particularly if you're in a swing seat. And I think maybe we'll talk about that in a little while. But it's much more difficult to be in a swing seat, which I think both myself and Anne Marie did sit in. You're running for office all the time because the terms are so short. You're constantly talking about what's going to happen in the next election. You're raising money for that election. And many of your colleagues, in fact, the majority of your colleagues, don't have to worry about that. They're in safe seats, and it allows them to treat their time in governing a good deal differently than you do. But anyway, I had a lot of wonderful experiences, was very fortunate to be there, and very fortunate also that the Speaker of the House appointed me to chair the British American Parliamentary Group, which for 4 years I did, and it governs the Congress's relationship with the British Parliament. And it's sort of the back and forth between Congress and Parliament, a wonderful institution. But I'm so happy to be here with you all and look forward to a very nice discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much to you both for setting us up so nicely. We've got a number of questions about partisanship and polarization, and you both to some extent alluded to this in your openings. Certainly to those of us observing Congress from the outside, one of the overwhelming impressions is that polarization, the division between the parties, has been growing. And a number of people are asking how that affects the way Congress works. How does it affect the possibility of passing legislation or working for toward bipartisan solutions toward things? I mean, Anne Marie, you said in your opening that you had experiences, at least in committees, where bipartisanship was the rule. So maybe we'll start with you. How do you see polarization affecting the way Congress works today?
Well, let me begin by saying it's very real. And I think today, maybe more than ever, there is a real aspect of polarization. But the thing that we all suffer from is this 24/7 news cycle. And the only thing that sells stories are, where Congress people are fighting, or there's, harsh debates on the floor, or there's all that's kind of what gets people's attention, because the stuff that goes on day in and day out and the committee hearings and all of those kinds of things, they're not that sexy. So the media doesn't get into the good part of it. They focus on, the tension that exists. And so that feeds a narrative. But it is unfortunate. And I think today more than ever, there is a polarization. I think right now we're in a new administration, and the Democrats just took over the Senate, very narrow margin, and same in the House, very narrow margin. And so it's my hope these couple of initial pieces of legislation are very partisan. The most recent American Cares Act that was just passed was a $1.9 trillion bill. Unfortunately, there were no Republican votes on either side of the House. So I think that's a problem. But I do think once things settle down, once everyone gets their footing, maybe it's going to be an infrastructure bill. But the American people, and many of them are hurting because of COVID. And so it's going to be a real challenge, but it's very important that members work together to get the assistance that the people need, and to do infrastructure, to do things that are going to create jobs. And I do hope that because of that need, that will force both parties to be a little more bipartisan and work together. But it's a challenge in this environment right now.
Thanks. Ben, do you want to add anything to that?
I would love to add something to that. I agree with a lot of that. I would like to say that one of the things that I realized when I was there was that the members of the House of Representatives of the Congress are tremendous reflections of their constituencies. And I think people forget, they tend to blame the politicians for the partisanship. But my experience was most of the partisanship came directly from the people that the elected folks represented. The partisanship is very deeply embedded in our society now. It has a great deal to do with the media environment that exists. People on both sides watch one set of news outlets or another, and they rarely watch both. And it causes the citizens to break up into armed camps, essentially, in very separate partisan camps. And a person like myself or Anne Marie were in very difficult circumstances because we represented swing districts. Now, if you were in a safe seat, which is about, I would say, 375 out of the 435, almost all of them are safe seats. They're either safely Republican or safely Democrat. And those seats, they worried about what their constituents said, and they worried about primary elections. So if you didn't hew to your party line, if you reached across the aisle to the other side, your reward would be to be punished by your own constituents. And nobody wanted to be punished by their own constituents. I don't think you have to go very much further than Pavlov to understand this. You know, when you ring a bell and the dog comes, and if you give them food, they're going to keep coming. But if they come and you hit them over the head by a 2x4, they're not going to come anymore. And that's what happens. You find out very quickly that if you do reach across the aisle, you get punished for it by your own constituents. So I think that's the root of the difficulty, personally. I think people would be much more bipartisan if they didn't have that problem, that their constituents just won't have it. So, you know, I think it has changed dramatically. Historically, I would point to the early 1990s as when this began to change fairly dramatically. And I think from my own perspective, now, granted, this is a Democratic perspective, but I think Newt Gingrich had a great deal to do with moving us in this direction. He was much more confrontational than many other characters in the Congress on both sides of the aisle. And it's just kind of snowballed from there, and both sides have had their parts to play in it as we moved along. And I think ultimately it is not good for our governmental system. It worries me.
Thanks. Those are really interesting observations about something that, as I said, for people on the outside looking at Congress, often find very, very troubling and hard to navigate. So these perspectives, I think, are very helpful. We've got a bunch of questions about sort of more about the nuts and bolts of what it's like to be a congressman. One question that we've gotten is, what do you think is the most important part of the job of a congressperson? Is it representing constituents' views, communicating with constituents and with your district, or is it more policy and Washington focused, debating national legislation? And I guess I'd add my own spin to that question and ask you maybe to sort of describe how you spend your time. What's a typical day or a typical week like, and how do you navigate between the various things that you've mentioned that members of Congress have to do, you know, communicating with constituents, learning about their own views and communicating your own understanding of the issues, working in committees with colleagues in Washington, working with lobbyists and other members of the Washington community, raising money. You've got a lot of balls in the air as a member of Congress. So what's the most important part of that, and how do you balance all these things? Anne-Marie, you want to tackle that?
The most important part is serving your constituents, as far as I was concerned, because that's the very tangible work that you do. Many of the things you do in Congress don't really go anywhere. So let's take committee work. And I'm not sure what leadership was thinking about when they did this to me, but I had 3 committees and I had 7 subcommittees. So just think if each of those subcommittees and the committees, the full committees, meet once a week even, you've got that piece of your day. That's a major piece of your day. Every time you go into a hearing, you're given a packet of papers to read, to understand what the issue is, what the hearing's on, whoever is going to be in the panel to testify, you've got to read all that. So that was a big part of the day. But as far as I was concerned, and the reason you have committee meetings is to work on legislation. But oftentimes, as I mentioned earlier, the legislation doesn't go anywhere. It would stop in the Senate. So that's one thing you did. Another thing you did, which I detested, but was a very real part of what you had to do, was go raise money. I can remember being in Congress for 3 months, trying to get my head around everything, just trying to find my way from my office to the Capitol. And someone said to me, "You have got to go start dialing for dollars." And I thought, what are you talking about? And he said, "You've got to start immediately." And Ben talked about this earlier, this issue of money and Washington and all of the rags in Washington, the Politico or the Hill or Roll Call, they look at you by the amount of money you've raised quarterly. And that's how they determine whether you're going to win again, whether you're going to, and it's not always true, but that's just the narrative. So there's raising money, there's committee work. There's meeting with constituents that would come to your office, visiting Washington, D.C., or meeting with lobbyists. So there was that piece. There were the votes. That's another big piece of your day. We had 3 sessions of votes every day. So you were over there from, like, say, 10 o'clock, and then maybe around 2 o'clock, and then maybe around 6 o'clock. That's another piece of your day. But really, the most important work you do, the most tangible work you do, is your district work. And so I had the most fabulous district director and a team here on the ground. It's real people calling up with a real problem. And it's a problem more likely than not you can solve. And so to be able to help a veteran, or to help a senior citizen, or to help someone who's having trouble with immigration or their papers, those are tangible problems, and you can do something about them in your position as a member of Congress. And so to me, that was the reason I was elected. And certainly the most important part of the work that I did.
Ben?
Well, it's hard to say which one's important because they're all important. And it just points out how much you've got on your plate and how many, as you said, Rob, how many balls are up in the air. It's really difficult for you to be able to manage these and get them in a way where you can handle all of them effectively. And I think the other thing, and I've already alluded to this, it makes a great deal of difference what kind of seat you held. If you were in a seat that was up for grabs between your party and the other party, and again, that's really just a handful of seats. I don't think people realize this who are not in the middle of the process. They're only really at the very most maybe 75 seats in play out of 435 in any given cycle. If you're in one of those seats, the lion's share of your time, quite frankly, is in your constituent work and in everything else is connected with whether you can hold that seat for your party. So you spend an inordinate amount of time trying to do that, and it hampers your ability to be active legislatively. At least that's what I found. If you had the luxury of sitting in a safe seat in either party, you could be much more involved legislatively. You would have more time to do it. You would also be able to move up in the hierarchy and ultimately have more influence. It's another reason why we have so much polarization, is that the people who are in leadership tend to be people who are in safe seats in one party or the other, and you don't have very many moderates, so to speak, in either party in leadership. So you don't get the moderate point of view. And that's, I think, an institutional problem that our system's got. And I'm not sure how we get around it, but it's connected with our electoral system and how it's set up. And it's also connected with the amount of money that's necessary. And we both alluded to this so far, and I'm sure we'll talk about it even more because it's central to the whole system. The amount of money that's spent on politics and on some of these seats is obscene. And anybody in Britain will certainly think it's obscene. Just to give you an example, every time I ran for public office, I spent in the neighborhood of $3 million every 2 years. Now, that's just for a seat in the middle of Kentucky to spend $3 million every 2 years to get elected. That just, you wouldn't think that would be good for the political system. And as a result, you've got to, in order to raise that money, you've got to take positions that are of interest to people who give the money. I mean, no need to beat around the bush about that. It's you've got constituencies that expect for you to be strong on their positions, and they align with you, and they provide money for you. You're spending a lot of time dealing with people who are trying to give you money. But it's still, at the end of the day, it's very much rewarding, but it comes with tremendous challenges, as I think you all can see.
Thanks. We've got a number of, continuing on the theme of parties. We've got a bunch more questions about parties. Samuel Pugh asks if you could talk a little bit about the differences between parties and in the United States and the UK. Maybe Ben, you can take that. But just to add on to that, Rafael Gonzalez asks, what are the consequences if you decide to cross party lines on a vote or on a piece of legislation? And maybe each of you could talk a little bit about the relationship between, rank and file members of Congress and the party leadership. So Ben, why don't we start with you, since you've got some experience on both sides of the pond? Just talk a little bit about the difference between parties in Congress and parties in Parliament.
All right. Well, as you know, we have a two-party system here in this country, and it's a little bit more diverse in Great Britain. You all have the Conservative or Tory Party, and you've got the Labour Party, which has in recent years been the second strongest party. But you've seen, of course, the Scottish National Party become a force as a strong third party. You've also got the Social Democrats and the Libs, the Lib Dems, I guess they're called now. They have been a factor, and they were certainly a factor in the Tory party coming to power a few years ago because they entered into a coalition with the Tory party. Uh, but the parties, we're actually becoming more and more like the British system. I think we're becoming more of a parliamentary system than we were before. It used to be in our country that you didn't necessarily have to toe the party line. You could reach across the aisle and it would work fine for you personally and for your own constituents. Now, though, as I said earlier on, you get punished if you reach across party lines. And we've seen some great examples of it. We've seen examples in the Republican Party just recently of people like Liz Cheney, who decided to vote against or to vote to impeach Donald Trump. And she has been attacked fairly heavily by lots of the constituencies of the Republican Party. And the same thing is now happening. You're hearing from the left on the Democratic side, Joe Manchin and some other moderates who don't want to toe the party line in the Senate on the Democratic side. They're coming under, I think, tremendous fire from their own party for doing that. And you're going to see a big battle on the filibuster, which is an interesting thing. The filibuster is something we may want to talk about at some point because it's going to become more and more important in whether anything passes in the Congress in the very near future. I don't think they've got anything like it in Britain. The party systems are completely different, typically between a parliamentary system and our system. And as you know, the executive branch and the legislative branch are combined in the parliamentary system. If you win the legislative majority, you control the executive. That's not the case in the United States. You often have a very stark and distinct difference between the executive and the legislative, and they are designed to be separate. In Great Britain, they're not designed to be separate. They're designed to work together.
Anne Marie, you want to talk about parties in Congress?
Sure. I do want to just a couple of points that Ben made. I just want to elaborate on those a little. So he has talked a number of times about red districts and blue districts. And this coming year, and this will be interesting for folks to watch, every 10 years, we do a census in this country and then we redistrict. And so now is the time, if we could make some of those districts less red and less blue and a little more purple, that would be the time where we could address this issue of partisanship and these seats that are just so crazy safe versus the very handful. There's just a few that are these purple ones. So that's coming up. That'll be interesting to watch. The state legislatures, in most cases, handle the redistricting and drawing new districts. The 750,000 people that there are constituents, they now, when they redistrict in New York State, the state legislature does it. And right now we have a completely democratically controlled state legislature here. They will redraw the districts. So the district that I represented has already gone through one iteration. Now it'll change again. And that's very difficult. It can result in really your seat changing dramatically. So that's one thing I wanted to talk about. The other thing is the reason, and Ben mentioned like Manchin and Sinema in the Senate, they're under such intense pressures because there's such a razor thin majority. In the Senate, it's 50-50. The vice president has to come in and break a tie if people go down their party line. So if Joe Manchin defects from his Republican colleagues or Democratic colleagues, or Kristen Sinema does, they lose that vote. So in this environment, it's even more intensified. And in the House, the Democrats have, I think right now it's about a 7-seat majority. A couple of the members have gone to work to serve in the president's cabinet. And so that's an issue. And there's a couple of open seats, both in the Republican and the Democratic side. So, and to Ben's earlier point, special elections have to be held. It isn't like the governor can appoint someone and put them in. So, but with such a razor thin margin, the parties have to stick together, and leadership will command you to stick together if it's a critical vote. For instance, this last one that we just passed, the American Rescue Act. Just with regards to the parties and the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, it's just, I don't know where to start, Ben. We could really spend the next 3 days talking about the differences of the party, how people think within the parties. And then there's variations of Republicans and variations of Democrats. So it's pretty complicated in terms of, why you think about, and then there's sort of the libertarian perspective as well. So I guess I won't say anything about that. If there's specific questions, how Republicans feel about certain things, I'm very happy to answer those questions.
Thanks. It gets very complicated very quickly. So thanks for making it understandable. We've got a couple of questions about voting, continuing on a similar theme. Someone's asked, do you think that moving to another voting system in the United States, such as ranked choice or single transferable votes, there's been a lot of talk in the States about some of these alternative voting systems. Do you think those kinds of voting systems might make a difference in the way people vote and would help to get rid of some of these safe seats and make congressional elections more competitive? And a related question that someone else asked is, how can voter turnout be improved in American elections? So a whole bunch of questions about voting. Anne-Marie, do you want to walk us through some of your thoughts about those things?
Sure. So this last presidential election, the voter turnout was quite significant. Both the Republican, President Trump, he received more votes than any previous Republican running for the presidency, somewhere between 75 and 80 million. And then President Biden had more than Barack Obama, more than any other Democrat, Bill Clinton. He received those votes. So the turnout for this election, because there was such a tremendous amount of interest in it, I think was very high. But it's the off-year elections, and there's a whole lot of smaller elections. That's a challenge to get people to understand that even politics that are local are important, and they affect your life sometimes more than what they're doing in Washington. So that, I think that's an issue. But the other part about changing the voting system, and that's been a topic of discussion here in the United States, because the House passed HR 1, which would fundamentally change our voting system. So currently, the states manage, and they are the ones, the legislature comes up with the system and how it's going to work in that state. Now, HR 1 federalizes elections, and so there's a lot of angst. There will be no bipartisanship on that bill. I can almost guarantee you that, because I think the Republicans' view is it really is a state issue. It's not something the federal government should control. And then there's other pieces of it. So I think a lot within the Republican Party would say voter ID and the system that we have, if it's done correctly, has worked for a number of years and would continue to work. But it's really, this last election, we got into such a problematic situation with all of the absentee ballots because of COVID. Some of the states changed, and some of the governors changed without the legislature's approval, their system of voting in that state. There were a lot of write-ins, there were a lot of mail ballots, and I think that affects the integrity of the election as well. So I think Republicans at this point would say voter ID and make sure we maintain the integrity of the system that's in place. And we have one election day. I think that's another pretty important piece of it. So now I'll hear from Ben.
Ben?
Well, this is a complicated issue, and I would, Anne Marie's smiling about that because she may know what I'm going to say. Republicans sometimes, on this particular issue, I think want to have it both ways. They want the states to be in charge, but yet when the states decide things that they don't like, they want to overturn what the states did. So, that's kind of what happened the last time. And as you know, it was incredibly complicated and difficult because and controversial, and led ultimately to the problem that we had on January 6th at the Capitol. This disbelief in the results of the election and uncertainty that was fueled, in my judgment, by our former president. But that has caused the polarization to be even worse. I don't think we're going to see any kind of a real major change in the voting, in the sense that, people are going to be able to choose more than one candidate and that sort of thing. I don't think you're ever going to see anything like that. Nobody's even proposing that sort of thing, even though it probably would have an effect on the partisanship that we see now, and it would allow proportional representation for maybe more than just the two parties. But this House Bill 1, which has passed the House, is incredibly, as Anne Marie said, it's incredibly divisive. The Republicans are very much against it. The Democrats are very much for it. And it breaks down really, and all these voting issues, I think, break down ultimately to which side thinks they're going to be helped the most by one system or the other. And I just think that there's tremendous difference of view on the part of each party on this subject, because they think one way will hurt them tremendously and the other way will help them tremendously. And this is where we get to the filibuster, which I alluded to earlier. I agree with Anne Marie's assessment. I don't think there are going to be any Republican votes for changing the way voting takes place, or for House Bill 1. There weren't in the House. I don't think there will be in the Senate. And the only way they can get it through is if they change the filibuster and not be required to have 60 votes, but can pass it with 50 votes and the vice president. And the reason that they think it's so important on the Democratic side is that the Republicans are, generally speaking, in control of the states, which is, in my view, another reason why the Republicans are in favor of state control, because they control the states. And they're going to be in favor of, having control of the redistricting in most of the states. And therefore, when the redistricting takes place, you're going to see more Republican seats, Republican leaning seats, than we have now. If the Democrats get this through, one of the provisions, for instance, of House Bill 1 is to have commissions, independent commissions, draw these districts rather than partisan political parties. And that's a controversial measure too. One that a lot of good government types would like to see go through, but I know that the parties are not in favor of that generally.
Thanks. Those are, it's really, you can really see how intricately connected the politics and the policymaking and partisanship are connected in the way you both answered those questions. And it gives us, I think, a little bit of insight into what we're observing in Congress right now. Someone asked a really interesting question. One of you alluded a few minutes ago to the fact that you're running for office as a member of the House every 2 years, and you barely arrive when you have to start at least raising money for your next election. And someone asks, does the duration of terms damage the effectiveness of the legislative process? And I'll add to that, would the House operate better or differently if your terms were longer? And did either of you ever sort of look longingly across the Capitol at your colleagues in the Senate who had 6 whole years before they had to run for re-election?
I'm gonna break in and give my very long answer, and that is yes, and turn it over to Anne Marie.
And
I got to
Marie?
agree. We look over there, they're such gentlemen. They're not worried about anything. 6 years, they get in and they're just, and they don't work very hard over there. It's the House is a very different place than the Senate. I'll stop there though.
All right, well, maybe next year, just a note for the organizers, maybe we should have a former senator in the next year's panel. You can get some arguments going between the houses. Thanks. A couple other questions about sort of, back to the sort of political reform issue. Here's a provocative one to both of you. If you could change one thing about the way American politics works, what would it be and why? And as a professor of American politics, I'm trying furiously to think of how I would answer this question. But fortunately for me, my job is to ask the questions and not answer them. So, if you could change one thing, I think this is a great question that might, improve or smooth over some of these issues that we've been hearing about. What would it be? Either one of you want to take that? Ben, you have a thought?
Free to jump in, but I guess I'll go ahead and I'll take it. There's just no way that you can. I mean, I would change the system fundamentally. Is what I would do. I would try to do anything I could to get the money out of the system to the best way possible. I think we ought to limit the length of campaigns. That's one of the great things that happens in the UK is that campaigns take place for a short period of time. Our campaigns are eternal. They start the day you get elected. The next one starts, and we're raising money the whole time. In the UK, you don't worry about your campaign until what, a month? I can't, 6 weeks. I can't remember what the exact number is, but it's a limited campaign. You're not allowed to campaign unless there's until it gets to that point. And as far as fundraising is concerned, what you're able to spend is dramatically limited as well. And I think that would, if you limited the amount of money that candidates spent, and that frankly outside groups were able to spend, and there's Supreme Court decisions that limit that, but we ought to attack those Supreme Court decisions because I think they're pernicious. But it's on the basis of our view, I think misguided view that money essentially equals speech. If you want to have free speech, you ought to be able to spend as much money as you want to spend. That's kind of the general view. And my right post to that has always been if money equals speech, then speech isn't free. But it's, it's a very complicated thing, and the money makes a big difference both in the running of the campaign and in the governing. So I would do something about the money. And of course, you can't overlook the redistricting problem. Both of those things are central, I think, to the difficulty.
All right, money and districting. Anne Marie, anything to add?
Yeah, I think, first of all, your question was about what we could change. And I will get into what Ben just mentioned. I think really one thing that should get changed, or which won't get changed, because it's interesting, everything we're talking about, all these aspects really have to do with speech. But the way the media portrays in this 24/7 nonstop polarizing news cycle that we all are sucked into, and it just continues on and on. But I don't think we can do anything about the media. But I disagree with Ben on the issue of speech. So when the forefathers came up with that First Amendment, it was this notion that political speech is probably more than any other form of speech or religion or was key. I mean, they were looking for political freedom. And so the court has, and I know he's talking about Citizens United, that's a highly controversial case where, it doesn't limit the funding that can go into a blind PAC. But be that as it may, I just think that we can't limit the amount of money in a campaign, as tempting as it is, because the first time I ran, I did grassroots. I spent $600,000 and my opponent spent $4 million. He was the incumbent and he took the national kind of approach. Second time we ran, as Ben says, these purple districts get such attention from the national media. I spent close to 4 million, he spent 6 million in a congressional race, and that just 2 years. That's a huge amount of money, but I don't think it can be limited. I mean, my personal view is it is speech. Someone is telling you what they favor and how they want to be represented. And to me, that's speech, and we shouldn't limit it.
And I just add, if I may, to that, I do just fundamentally disagree with that, because people with a great deal of money, of course, have a great advantage if they're able to. My speech, if I don't have very much money, isn't nearly as free as somebody else's speech who has millions of dollars to put into an election. And it's a fundamental problem. And, you know, I think we can do it. Now, we have laws that are in place that prevent us from doing it right now, but I think we ought to change those laws. I think it can be done, and I think the UK does do it right now. And the UK is a free society, just like ours is. So I just think the UK political electoral system is much better than ours, because it doesn't require all this money. And when you don't have to spend all your time raising this money, you really have an opportunity to lend your voice to governing a whole lot more. And I think that's very, very important.
Well, I don't think we're gonna settle this issue here, but I hope people in the audience see some of the really knotty problems that these issues pose for members of Congress, for people running for Congress, and for people thinking about how to improve the functioning of the government. But you both mentioned the Supreme Court in your answers to that question. We've got a couple of questions about the court. Gia asks, why are Supreme Court justices not neutral compared to the UK? And Isabella Bostock similarly asks if you feel betrayed, is her word, by the growing politicization of the Supreme Court. And do you feel that rights or other things are threatened by the way the Supreme Court has become sort of sucked into some of the politicization of Congress that we've just been describing? Ben, you want to start off on that?
Well, the Supreme Court in the United States has always been partisan on some level, I think. It's just the very nature of it. And you get into the nature of how judges are appointed, whether they ought to be appointed by life, for life. Our system in our Constitution, it's embedded in our Constitution that Article 3 judges are appointed for life. Whether that's a good idea or not, I don't know. Our founders certainly thought it was, and you'd have to have a constitutional amendment to change it, which isn't likely to happen. But the court has fundamentally been attuned to politics, I would submit, from the beginning of the foundation of the country. And you just can't. They're supposed to be nonpartisan. I think, frankly, that a lot of them try very hard to be nonpartisan, but they're human beings, and they have a particular point of view when they come into office. Often a president chooses them for that point of view on knotty problems like abortion, or the problems that get the most play. The size of government, the limited size of government, or not so limited, how you want to interpret laws, whether you are activist or not activist. There are just a lot of different ways that judges are viewed, and they are chosen by presidents of one party or another. And this is one of the maybe the biggest point of contention in a presidential race is the appointing of Supreme Court judges. It's a major thing that a president does. It's an appointment for life, and it can fundamentally change or preserve the laws of the land for generations to come.
And Marie, anything to add?
No, well, I to Ben's point, I do think they're human beings, and they're not deaf, dumb, and blind to what is going on around them. But it is a fundamental approach about whether or not you're going to be a constitutionalist or an institutionalist versus being a more activist judge. I mean, that's just sort of how it's divided up, but you saw the Kavanaugh hearings and that appointment, you saw Amy Coney Barrett, and there was such an outcry from the other side because they knew when President Trump appointed these two and to the Supreme Court, this is a lifetime position. And so people do care deeply about it. And I think, and Ben mentioned this, I think it's probably one of the most important things a president does, because long after he's out of office, that legacy lives on. And whether or not, philosophically, there's a, whether there's a majority or minority of one side or the other.
It's a really interesting relationship among the branches, and especially with the Supreme Court, which has a little bit of a different political character than the so-called political branches, Congress and the president. I think we have time for one more question. And that is, someone asks about what you think about the storming of the Capitol on January 6th of this year. And I think what we're interested in is less what you think of the motivations behind it or the people who engaged in it, but as a former member of Congress, imagining yourself back in the chamber or in the Capitol or in your office while this is going on. I just love to hear your reflections on that event. Whether, have you spoken to former colleagues of yours who were there on that day, and what did you get from them? It's not something we don't like to think about being a member of Congress as a dangerous job, but I think we all watched with some horror and dismay as that was going on. So let's close with some reflections on that event. Anne-Marie, you want to start us off on that?
Sure. I mentioned when I first started out today about walking up those stairs that they're made out of marble, and they've actually have grooves in them from so many people going up and down them. The Capitol building is really a sacrosanct place, and you can't help but feel that when you go in it. So what happened on January 6th was just something that I think all Americans saw it as an assault on our republic, and we're very concerned with the violence and how everything played out that day. And I do think that there's an investigation going on. At the end of the day, people need to be held accountable. There's no question about that. But I do think it's important, if we talk about that violence, that we have to talk about the United States for the past year has undergone horrific violence. And while the members of Congress that day, and I have spoken to the person who represents this district about his feelings that day, think of the businesses and the families who are and have been disrupted by the violence, whether it's in Minnesota or Portland or Seattle. We have to be clear that all violence is bad. It's just the Capitol was sort of a symbolic, that's our democracy, we don't want anything to happen to it. And so it seemed to be even worse. But the violence that's gone on in this nation for the past year, right now it's going on in Portland, it all has to be condemned. That's not how we're going to solve problems in this country. It's the reason we do Congress to Campus. We can have civil discourse. We can disagree politely without being violent. And that's going to be the key to keeping this nation on its feet and going forward. But I think we can't decry just one episode of violence. I think it really is far more, it's a national problem, and it's really all the people involved have to be held to account.
And your thoughts on January 6th?
Well, I would say that all of the violence I would decry. And I just think that violence, none of it should take place. But I don't frankly equate the two. I think that what happened at the Capitol is tremendously different. And it was the result of an issue about the national election for the presidency. And it was driven by the president of the United States, who could not bring himself to tell the truth to the citizens of his own country. I mean, it's very, very unusual when you have a country that and its capital, which is threatened by its own president with violence. And I just am still astonished by that. And I can't believe that it's been condoned by a number of people in the political process. I think it, just as a person who tries very, very hard to be as really, frankly, nonpartisan as I possibly can, to see that happen to the citadel of our nation and have it driven by language used by our president, not just on one day, but over several months of frankly, false accusations about an election, is a very different matter, in my judgment, from the rest of the violence. And certainly the rest of the violence is deplorable. But this situation is particularly bad.
Well, with that, we've come to the end of our hour. I think this has been a great session, ranging widely, thinking about what it's just physically, what it's like in a day-to-day sense being a member of Congress, to the ways in which American public officials engage with a wide range of issues. So I really want to thank the RAI and the embassy and all of those who helped us put on this event. I want to thank all of our participants and apologize to the many, many, many of you who asked questions that we just didn't have time for. And especially, I want to thank our two panelists, former Congresswoman Anne-Marie Buerkle and former Congressman Ben Chandler. Thank you so much for a very stimulating session. I wish everyone a good evening.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you very much.